Story 1: The Man Who Never Left the Last Train. Most people have taken a subway train late at night. Maybe after work, maybe after a night out, maybe because it was the only way home. And if you've ever ridden one after midnight, you know something about the atmosphere changes. The crowds disappear, the platforms feel bigger, the echo of footsteps lasts longer than it should. And sometimes you realize you're sharing the station with someone who shouldn't be there. This story comes from a subway operator who worked the late shift in New York in the early 2000s. And even after years of driving trains through hundreds of stations, he still refuses to run the last train past one specific platform, because one night someone got on his train. Someone who never got off, and who may not have been alive to begin with. Mark Delaney had been working for the subway system for almost 7 years. By that point, nothing really surprised him anymore. If you've never worked in public transit, you might think the job is simple. Drive the train, stop at stations, open doors, repeat. But subway workers see things most people never do. They see the city after everyone else has gone home. They see the drunks sleeping on benches, the night workers heading home, the occasional person wandering the tunnels who definitely shouldn't be there, and sometimes they see things that don't make sense at all. Mark mostly worked the late-night routes, which meant he was usually driving trains between midnight and 4 in the morning. Those hours had their own rhythm. The trains ran less frequently. Stations were nearly empty. Sometimes entire platforms would be completely silent when the train pulled in, and when the doors opened, no one would get on, no one would get off. Just the sound of the train idling in a cavern of concrete. Mark had grown used to that quiet, but there was one station he never liked stopping at. It was an older underground station on a line that passed through several historic neighborhoods. The station had been there for nearly a century. Its tiled walls were cracked. Some of the lights flickered constantly, and the platform always seemed darker than the others, even when every light was working. Operators had a nickname for it. They called it the empty platform, not because it was abandoned, but because almost nobody ever seemed to be there, even during the day. Still, it was a stop like any other. And Mark had driven through it hundreds of times. Nothing strange had ever happened, until one winter night. It was just after 2:30 a.m. The city was quiet. Most of the train cars behind him were nearly empty. Mark slowed the train as it approached the station. The tunnel lights flashed across the windshield as the train glided into the platform. The brakes hissed softly, the train stopped. Mark pressed the control that opened the doors. The familiar chime echoed through the cars. He leaned slightly toward the side mirror to check the platform, and at first everything looked normal. The platform was empty just like always, dim lights, old tiled walls. The yellow safety strip running along the edge, but then Mark noticed something strange. Near the far end of the platform, someone was standing there. A man. He was facing away from the train. Standing perfectly still, Mark frowned. That wasn't unusual by itself. Plenty of people took late trains, but something about the way the man stood made Mark uneasy. He wasn't moving. Not shifting his weight, not pacing, just standing, like he had been there for a long time. Mark watched him through the mirror. Finally, the man slowly turned and started walking toward the train. His movements were slow, almost stiff. He wore a long, dark coat. His hair looked messy, like he hadn't slept in days. As he got closer, Mark noticed something else. The man's face looked wrong. Not injured, not disfigured, just strangely blank, no expression, no emotion. He walked into one of the cars near the middle of the train. The doors closed. Mark pulled away from the platform. Normally, operators didn't think much about individual passengers. But for some reason, Mark couldn't stop thinking about that man. Something about him felt off. After a few minutes, curiosity got the better of him. Mark used the internal monitor system to check the train cars. The cameras switched between different cars. Most were empty. A few passengers sat scattered across the train, and then the screen switched to the car where the man had boarded. He was standing in the center aisle, not holding the pole, not sitting down. Just standing completely still. The train swayed slightly as it moved through the tunnel, but the man barely moved. Mark watched for several seconds, then the camera switched to the next car. He tried to ignore the strange feeling creeping into his chest. The next station came. The train slowed, doors opened, a few passengers got off, a few got on. Mark checked the monitors again. The man was still standing in the same spot, exactly the same way, not moving, not looking around, just staring forward. The next station passed, then another. Each time Mark checked the monitor. Each time the man hadn't moved. Nearly 20 minutes passed. Finally, something changed. On the monitor, the man slowly turned his head, not toward the door, not toward the other passengers, but directly toward the camera, and for the first time, Mark saw his face clearly. His skin looked pale, almost gray, his eyes were wide open, but the strangest part was his expression. Or the lack of one. He looked like someone who had forgotten how to be human. Just as Mark leaned closer to the screen, the man suddenly smiled. Not a friendly smile, not even a threatening one. Just a slow, unnatural stretching of the mouth, and then the screen flickered. When the image came back, the man was gone. The aisle was empty. Mark felt his stomach drop. He quickly cycled through the other cameras, car after car, passengers sitting, some sleeping, some looking at their phones, but the man in the coat was nowhere. And then Mark noticed something worse. The train hadn't stopped since the man boarded. There had been no station where he could have gotten off, which meant one of two things had happened. Either the man had moved somewhere the cameras couldn't see, or he was no longer on the train at all. The next station approached. The train slowed, doors opened, passengers stepped off. Mark checked the monitors again, still no sign of him. The train continued, station after station, no trace of the man. Eventually, Mark reached the end of the line. All passengers exited. The train sat empty. Maintenance workers boarded to inspect the cars. Mark asked one of them a simple question. "Did you see a man in a dark coat on this train?" The worker shook his head. "Nope. Just the usual crowd." Mark didn't say anything else, but as he shut down the train and walked toward the exit tunnel, he passed the platform and froze. Standing near the far end of the platform was the same man, the same dark coat, the same blank expression, exactly where Mark had first seen him, standing perfectly still. Like he had never boarded the train at all. Mark never spoke to him, he simply walked away. And from that night forward, every time his train approached that station after midnight, he checked the far end of the platform, because sometimes the man was still there, waiting for the last train. Story 2, The Voice from Platform 0. If you've ever waited alone in a subway station late at night, you probably remember the silence, not the normal silence. The kind where every small sound becomes louder than it should be, the hum of electrical cables, the distant rattle of a train somewhere deep in the tunnels, your own footsteps echoing off the walls. Most people assume subway stations shut down after the last train leaves, but the truth is they never really sleep. Maintenance workers move through the tunnels, cleaning crews sweep the platforms. Security guards patrol empty corridors, and sometimes when the last train has already left, someone else is still waiting, even when there are no trains coming. This story was shared by a transit maintenance worker who worked underground for nearly 12 years. He spent most of his nights walking through tunnels that passengers never see. Tunnels older than the city streets above them, tunnels that stretched for miles in darkness. And according to him, the most disturbing place in the entire system wasn't a tunnel at all. It was a platform that officially didn't exist, a platform workers called Platform 0. Daniel Ruiz started working for the Transit Authority when he was 26 years old. He had previously worked construction jobs, and someone told him the subway maintenance division paid better. The job was simple enough: inspect rails, repair damaged wiring, check signals. Most of the work happened after midnight when the trains stopped running. That meant long nights underground, but Daniel didn't mind. At first, he liked the quiet. And the tunnels had their own strange beauty: old brick walls, rusty metal doors that hadn't been opened in decades, graffiti left by workers from generations before. But after a few years, Daniel started noticing something strange. The subway maps passengers saw weren't entirely accurate. There were extra corridors, hidden maintenance shafts. Old platforms sealed behind metal gates. Some of them dated back nearly 100 years. One night during a break, Daniel mentioned this to an older worker named Marcus. Marcus had been working underground since the early 1980s. He laughed. "You think that's strange?" Marcus said. "You haven't seen half of it yet." Daniel asked what he meant. Marcus leaned back against the wall and lowered his voice slightly. "You ever heard of Platform Zero?" Daniel shook his head. Marcus smiled. "That's because it's not supposed to exist." At first Daniel assumed Marcus was joking, but a few nights later he learned Marcus wasn't joking at all. It happened during a late shift inspection. Daniel and two other workers were assigned to check a stretch of track between two major stations. It was around 2:15 a.m. The last train had already passed through. The tunnels were quiet. Daniel walked along the narrow maintenance path beside the tracks with his flashlight. The beam bounced across cables and damp concrete walls. About 15 minutes into the inspection, Daniel noticed something unusual: a staircase. It led upward to a metal door. That wasn't unusual by itself. There were many maintenance exits in the tunnels, but this one was strange. The door had no number, no warning signs, just a faded metal plate that looked like it had been painted over multiple times. Daniel pushed it open. The door creaked loudly. Behind it was a staircase, old, dusty, barely lit. He climbed the stairs. When he reached the top, he found himself standing on a subway platform. But something about it felt wrong immediately. The platform looked extremely old, older than any station Daniel had seen. The tile walls were cracked, many of the lights were broken. And the station name sign had been removed. The only thing that remained was the faint outline where it used to be. Daniel walked slowly across the platform. His footsteps echoed. There were no advertisements, no maps, no benches, just a long, empty platform. He checked the tunnel opening. There were rails, but they looked rusty, unused. Daniel assumed the platform had simply been abandoned decades earlier. Cities often built stations that were never used. He turned to leave, but just as he reached the stairs, he heard something. A voice. It came from somewhere down the platform, soft, barely audible. Daniel turned slowly. The platform was empty. He listened again. At first he thought it might be a radio transmission from another worker, but then he heard the voice again, whispering. He couldn't make out the words, just the sound of someone speaking quietly. Daniel walked toward the sound. The whispering stopped. He waited. Nothing. Then suddenly the loudspeaker system crackled to life. The old intercom speakers above the platform buzzed with static. Daniel froze because this station clearly had no power. The lights barely worked. The rails were rusted. The platform looked abandoned, and yet the speaker above him suddenly came alive. A distorted announcement echoed across the empty platform. "Next train arriving, Platform Zero." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine because there was only one problem. There was no train line connected to this platform anymore, and the system was supposed to be shut down completely for the night. Then he heard it, from deep inside the tunnel, a sound. Metal wheels grinding against rails, a train, but Daniel knew that was impossible. No trains were scheduled for hours. The sound grew louder, closer. The tunnel filled with the echo of something moving through it. Daniel stepped back slowly. The rails below the platform vibrated. The air pressure shifted, like something large was approaching fast. And then the tunnel lights flickered, one by one. Far down the tunnel, something moved in the darkness. Headlights appeared, but they looked wrong, too dim, too yellow, like lights from another era. Daniel stared into the tunnel, his heart pounding. The shape of an old subway train slowly emerged from the darkness. It rolled toward the platform, metal screeching, windows dark, paint peeling. The train looked ancient, like something from the early 1900s, and as it slowed beside the platform, Daniel realized something even worse. The train was full. Every window had someone sitting inside. But none of them were moving, none of them were speaking. They were all just sitting there, perfectly still, staring forward. The train stopped. The doors slid open with a slow metallic groan. And the platform became silent again. Daniel didn't move. Every instinct in his body told him something was very wrong, because the passengers inside the train still hadn't moved, not a single one. They just sat there, facing forward. Then one of them slowly turned their head toward the platform and looked directly at Daniel. The person's face was pale, almost gray, their eyes wide and empty. And then the entire train car began turning toward him. One by one, every passenger, all staring directly at him. Daniel took a step back, then another. The doors of the train remained open, waiting, as if inviting him inside. Behind him, the loudspeaker crackled again, and the same distorted voice whispered across the empty platform. "Final boarding, platform 0. Daniel turned and ran. He sprinted down the stairs and slammed the metal door behind him. His heart raced as he ran back through the tunnel toward his crew. He never told them exactly what he saw that night. But he did ask Marcus one question later. "What is platform 0? Marcus didn't smile this time, he just said something quietly. "That platform was closed after a train disappeared there in 1932. Daniel asked what happened to the passengers. Marcus shrugged. "No one ever found them." Then he looked directly at Daniel. "And every few years, someone says they hear a train down there." Daniel tried to convince himself that what he had seen that night was a mistake, a trick of the light. Maybe some kind of maintenance train he didn't recognize. Maybe an electrical malfunction that activated the old announcement system. But the more he thought about it, the less sense any of it made. For one thing, that platform shouldn't have had power. Most of the wiring down there had been disconnected decades earlier. And even if a train somehow passed through that section of tunnel, it would have had to connect to an active rail line. According to the maintenance maps, that rail line had been sealed off long ago. Still, Daniel told himself the same thing people always say after experiencing something impossible. There had to be a logical explanation. The next night, he tried to forget about it. Work went on as usual: track inspections, signal testing, routine repairs, but the memory of that platform lingered in the back of his mind. And the image he couldn't shake was the moment when all the passengers in that train had slowly turned their heads toward him, every single one of them, at the exact same time, watching him, waiting. 2 nights passed, then 3. Daniel avoided the area where he had found the staircase, but on the 4th night, the maintenance schedule changed. His crew was assigned to inspect a section of tunnel very close to that same spot. Daniel didn't mention what had happened before. He didn't want to sound crazy. But as they walked along the tunnel with their flashlights, Daniel felt that uneasy sensation creeping back into his chest. The staircase was only about 100 feet ahead. He tried not to look at it, but when they reached it, Marcus suddenly stopped. "You hear that?" Marcus asked. Daniel froze. At first there was nothing, just the normal quiet of the tunnels. Then faintly, very faintly, they heard something, a sound drifting down the staircase, a metallic rumble. Marcus slowly tilted his head. "That's not possible," he muttered. Daniel felt his stomach tighten because he recognized the sound immediately. It was the same sound he had heard before, a train moving through rails that weren't supposed to exist anymore. Marcus climbed the staircase first. Daniel followed slowly behind him. When they reached the door, Marcus pushed it open. The same old platform stretched out in front of them. But tonight it looked slightly different. Several lights were flickering more brightly than before, and the loudspeaker system above the platform was humming quietly. Marcus stepped forward cautiously. "You see this?" he said quietly. Daniel nodded. Then they both heard it, the voice, whispering again, soft, unclear, coming from somewhere farther down the platform. Marcus walked toward the sound. Daniel followed. The whispering stopped. Marcus shined his flashlight down the empty platform. Nothing, just cracked tiles and shadows. Then suddenly the loudspeaker crackled again. The sound was louder this time. A burst of static exploded through the station, and then the announcement came, clearer than before. "Next train arriving, platform 0. Marcus turned slowly toward Daniel. "You didn't tell anyone about this place, did you?" he asked. Daniel shook his head. Marcus frowned. "That system hasn't had power in 30 years. Before Daniel could reply, they both heard it, the rumble in the tunnel. The rails began vibrating. The air pressure shifted again. Marcus whispered something under his breath, and then the headlights appeared, the same dim yellow glow emerging from the darkness of the tunnel. The old train rolled forward slowly, metal grinding. Rust flakes falling from its sides, its windows dark, but the shapes inside were still visible. Passengers, rows and rows of them, all sitting perfectly still. Marcus stared in disbelief. "What the hell?" he whispered. The train screeched to a stop beside the platform. The doors slid open. The same heavy metallic groan echoed across the station. And once again, the platform fell silent. Daniel felt his pulse pounding in his ears. Marcus slowly stepped closer to the train. "Don't," Daniel said quietly, but Marcus ignored him. He approached one of the open doors and looked inside. Daniel watched from several feet away. Marcus leaned forward slightly, then froze. His flashlight beam trembled. "Daniel," Marcus said softly. "What?" Daniel replied. Marcus didn't look away from the train car. "You need to see this." Daniel hesitated. Every instinct told him not to move, but slowly he stepped closer. He looked inside the train and immediately felt the cold rush of fear flood through his body, because the passengers sitting inside the train weren't normal. Their clothing looked outdated. Styles from decades earlier, old coats, hats, dresses that looked like they belonged in black and white photographs. Their skin looked pale, almost wax-like, and none of them were blinking. None of them were breathing. They just sat there, facing forward like mannequins or corpses. Then one of them moved, just slightly. A woman near the middle of the car slowly turned her head. Her eyes locked onto Daniel, her mouth opened slightly, and she whispered something. Daniel couldn't hear the words, but Marcus did, because Marcus suddenly stumbled backward. "What did she say?" Daniel asked. Marcus didn't answer. He just kept staring at the train. Then the woman stood up. Slowly, mechanically, one by one, the other passengers began standing too. Their movements stiff, unnatural, like puppets being pulled upright by invisible strings. And then they all began walking toward the doors, toward the platform. Marcus grabbed Daniel's arm. "We need to go," he said, but it was already too late. The first passenger stepped onto the platform. The woman who had spoken earlier, her eyes never left Marcus. She whispered something again. This time Daniel heard it clearly. "You missed your train." More passengers began stepping out behind her. Dozens of them, silent, watching. Marcus pulled Daniel toward the staircase. They ran down the stairs and slammed the metal door shut. Behind the door they heard footsteps, slow, dragging footsteps approaching the stairs. Marcus grabbed the heavy maintenance lock and slammed it into place. The footsteps reached the other side of the door. Something bumped against the metal, once, twice. Then the loudspeaker crackled again, even louder now. The distorted voice echoed down the staircase. "Final boarding, platform 0. Marcus looked at Daniel with wide eyes. "We're not staying here," he said. They ran through the tunnel until they reached the next active station. Neither of them spoke about it again that night, but a week later something strange happened. Marcus stopped showing up for work. At first everyone assumed he was sick, then days passed. Transit supervisors tried calling him, no answer. Eventually someone visited his apartment. Marcus was gone. All of his belongings were still there. His phone, his wallet, even his car, but Marcus himself had disappeared. There was no sign of a struggle, no explanation, nothing. Daniel never told anyone what they had seen on Platform 0, but sometimes, during late-night shifts when the tunnels are quiet, he hears something drifting through the darkness. A distant metallic rumble, the sound of an old train moving through rails that shouldn't exist anymore. And once, only once, he heard the loudspeaker echoing through the tunnel again. The same distorted announcement. Next train arriving, Platform 0, and somewhere deep underground, a train door slowly sliding open. Story 3, the last passenger of Track 12. Most people assume subway systems are carefully monitored. Cameras everywhere, security patrols, station staff. The truth is that after midnight, huge parts of subway systems become almost completely empty. Platforms stretch for hundreds of feet with no one on them. Long tunnels disappear into darkness. And if you're working the last train of the night, sometimes you realize something unsettling. You may not be alone, but you might be the only one who's actually supposed to be there. This story came from a subway cleaner who worked the overnight shift for nearly 8 years. And according to him, there was one platform in the system that maintenance workers refused to clean alone. Not because it was dangerous, not because it was dirty, but because sometimes, long after the last train had passed, someone was still waiting on the platform, someone who had been waiting for years. Luis Herrera started working for the Transit Authority when he was 32. The job wasn't glamorous. He cleaned train cars and platforms during overnight hours. But it paid well, and the schedule allowed him to spend time with his family during the day. Most nights followed the same routine. The last train would run sometime around 1:45 a.m. After that, cleaning crews moved through the stations. They swept trash, washed platforms, wiped graffiti. By 4 a.m., the stations were clean again, ready for the morning rush. Lewis usually worked with a small team, but occasionally certain stations were assigned to a single cleaner. One of those stations was called Track 12. Track 12 was located in an older underground section of the subway system. The station itself was rarely used. Most trains passed through it without stopping. Because of that, it stayed relatively empty compared to other stations. Lewis didn't mind cleaning it alone. In fact, he liked it. The quiet made the job easier. One night around 2:20 a.m., Lewis arrived at the station to begin cleaning. The last train had already left. The platform was empty, or at least it looked empty at first. Lewis pushed his cleaning cart across the platform. His footsteps echoed loudly in the station. He began sweeping near the far end of the platform. After about 10 minutes, he noticed something strange. Someone was sitting on one of the benches. Lewis stopped sweeping. He hadn't seen the person when he first arrived. The man sat at the bench closest to the tunnel entrance. He wore an old dark coat. His head was slightly tilted downward. Lewis assumed he had simply missed the last train. It happened occasionally. Some passengers fell asleep or arrived too late. Lewis walked over to him. "Hey," Lewis said, "no more trains tonight." The man didn't move. Lewis stepped closer. "You'll have to come back in the morning." Still nothing. The man remained perfectly still. Lewis wondered if he was asleep. He leaned forward slightly. And that's when he noticed something unsettling. The man's eyes were open, wide open, but he wasn't blinking. Lewis stepped back. "Sir," he said again. The man slowly lifted his head. His eyes locked onto Lewis. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the man asked something quietly. "Has the train arrived yet?" Lewis frowned. "No trains until morning." The man's expression didn't change. He simply nodded slowly. Then he looked back toward the tunnel. Lewis waited a moment. "You can't stay here," he said. "Station's closed." The man didn't respond. He just kept staring into the dark tunnel. Lewis sighed and returned to sweeping. He assumed the man would eventually leave. But 20 minutes later, the man was still sitting there, in the exact same position. Lewis walked back over. "You really need to leave." The man turned his head slowly. His voice sounded strangely calm. "I'm waiting." "For what?" Lewis asked. "For my train." Lewis pointed toward the tunnel. "There are no trains tonight." The man didn't reply. Instead, he asked a question. "What year is it?" Lewis paused. 2007, he said. The man stared at him, then slowly shook his head. "That can't be right." Lewis felt uneasy. The man's clothes looked outdated. The coat style looked like something from decades earlier. Lewis decided to call station security. But just as he reached for his radio, something echoed through the tunnel. A sound, a distant metallic rumble. Lewis froze, because the subway schedule clearly showed no trains running for hours. But the sound was unmistakable. A train approaching. The rails began vibrating. The wind pushed through the tunnel. Lewis looked toward the darkness. The man on the bench slowly stood up. A faint smile spread across his face. "It's finally here," he whispered. Lewis grabbed his radio. "Control, this is track 12, he said. "Are there any trains scheduled right now?" Static answered him. Then a confused voice replied, "Negative, all lines are closed." Lewis looked back toward the tunnel. Headlights appeared in the darkness, dim, yellow, older than the modern trains. The train rolled slowly toward the platform, metal screeching, paint peeling from its sides. Lewis had never seen a train like it. It looked ancient, like something from the 1940s. The train stopped beside the platform. The doors opened slowly. Lewis stepped backward. The man walked forward. Lewis noticed something terrifying as the doors opened. The train cars were full. Passengers filled every seat, but none of them were moving. They all sat perfectly still, facing forward like statues. The man turned toward Lewis. "Thank you for waiting with me," he said quietly. Lewis stared at him. "What train is this?" The man smiled faintly. "The one I missed." He stepped into the train car. The passengers inside slowly turned their heads toward him, then toward Louis. All of them at the same time. Louis felt his heart pounding in his chest. He backed away slowly. The man stood inside the train doorway, then he spoke one final sentence. "You should never stay after the last train." The doors closed. The train began moving again, slowly disappearing back into the tunnel. Within seconds, the station was silent again. Louis stood alone on the platform. His radio crackled. "Track 12, you still there?" Louis didn't answer right away because something had caught his attention. He walked toward the bench where the man had been sitting and saw something resting on the seat. An old subway ticket. The paper was yellow and fragile. Louis picked it up carefully. The date printed on it made his stomach drop. It read, October 14, 1953. Louis never worked track 12 again. But sometimes during late shifts, other workers claim they hear something strange near that platform, a faint rumbling, a train moving through tunnels that aren't connected anymore. And occasionally security cameras capture something unsettling, a man in an old dark coat, sitting on the bench, waiting for a train that hasn't arrived in 70 years.